Glad you're here. Glad you've made it. There are chocolates on your seat, and those are a gift from me to you. We were in Europe for the last like 10 days. I don't know. It feels like forever. It was. We were there. We basically lived there, and we went to Europe, and we went and saw everything that we could see. There was a day we were in Zurich, and they have chocolates. If you don't know anything about Swiss chocolates, my kids were excited because they thought that that's where Swiss Miss was made. Because we live that classy life. And they're like, is that like Swiss Miss? And we're like, no, I'm going to guess that's made in Arkansas. Like, I don't think it's quite as exotic. But they had chocolates there. So I thought of this as we were going into this Lent series, that I should stop and get you Lent chocolates. See what I did there? Yeah, and so you can eat them, you can choose not to, it's up to you. We'll get to this in a second, why these matter, and we will talk about this for a second. But as we begin this series, I thought it'd be fun for you to have those. And here's the other, just full disclosure from me to you. We were backpacking through a lot of this area, which is something I did not think I'd do at this age. I thought that was something I would do like 20 years ago, but we decided we didn't want like rolling bags and all kinds of stuff going with us. We were on trains, and we didn't have a lot of extra space. So I only had a backpack on me, so some of yours are from Switzerland. Some I just had to buy at Target and Mitchell Ranch. I couldn't quite carry all of them, and you decide which one's which. It's up to you. I'm not telling you who got what. So my guess is that they're exactly the same. But we were in Zurich, and they had the Swiss chocolate factory. But something else that happened in Zurich that's kind of interesting around this idea of Lent that I think is important for us to understand. There was a time where there was this fasting and this thing called Lent that all of the church did. If you're not familiar with what Lent is, it's actually an ancient practice. It's been around for a very long time, and it's actually something I think is very valuable. I think it's something that's necessary maybe for our spiritual lives. If it's a fast time, it's where you fast, and maybe you're not familiar with fasting besides like unless it has the word intermittent in front of it, because you know those people who love to fast once a week and they tell you all about it. Maybe that's something that you're used to, is that part of it. This is something that's a little bit different. This type of fasting was something that was created by the church. Actually, all the way back in 325 AD, we see this Council of Nicaea, which is where the church fathers from the area, like from all over Europe and even the Middle East a little bit, get together and they talk about what are we going to do together? Like, what are the things we can all agree on? And one of the things that they talk about is this idea of Lent, which is a season. It's a 40-day season of fasting and preparation for Easter. And the whole idea is leading up to Easter. And so there was this intentional deprivation of depriving oneself, of kind of taking a step back and fasting from something to get ready for Easter. Now that's changed a little bit. It was 40 days. That's, in case you're not familiar with this, Jesus fasted for 40 days. That's why they chose 40 days. And so there was a fast that Jesus did early in his ministry. We'll talk about that later in the series. There was a 40-day fast. If you really count this, what's going to happen is it starts on Ash Wednesday, which is next Wednesday. That's when we're having the worship night. That was not a coincidence. We're going to worship together and celebrate and begin on Ash Wednesday. And if you count it, it goes from Ash Wednesday to Good Friday, which is the Friday right before Easter. That's the span of Lent. If you count it, it's actually not 40 days, it's 44 days. For some reason, they decided that Sundays didn't count. And so if you were coming to church and you were like already worshiping, that doesn't count as a day, which when you're fasting, every day counts as a day. And so they didn't count those. So it is a 44-day season now that is Lent. And I think there's some really important things that happen here. But what happened along the way, so in 325, there was this agreement that we would all fast just like Jesus fasted. We would get ready for this season. There was going to be some fasting, some intentional deprivation that we were going to do. But what happened is as that developed, as it created its own kind of season, what happened is people started to lose the way of what it was. And what they started to look at, and if you're thinking about fasting the way that I think about fasting, here's the first thing that comes to your mind. The first thing you think about is what you have to give up, right? That's where your mind goes. So what do I have to give up? What do I have to do with that? What do I lose? What do I take away? But the early church fathers, and what I think is beautiful about this, and even when Jesus himself fasted, he wasn't worried about what he had to give up. He was worried about what he could gain. He wasn't looking at fasting as what do I give up, but he's looking at it as what can I gain. By making this space in my life, by making this intentional interruption in my life, if I do that, what can I gain from that time? I don't think we think about fasting that way very often. I don't think we look at it through the lens of what can I gain? If I were to give something else up, what would I gain? Every one of you know this, but saying yes to one thing is saying no to a million other things, right? And it's the same when it comes to fasting. If I say yes to giving this thing up and I'm saying no to all these other things, then what does that make space for in my life? What are the things that I can now do? See, as it started in 325, it was this beautiful sacrament and this beautiful ceremony. And there was this thing for 40 days. It was all the church was doing this. But what happened after that is it started to become less about what can we gain from this time, and it became only about what do we have to give up. That's where we started to see things like Carnival, if you're familiar with Carnival. It became what's now called Mardi Gras. In our culture, we would know Mardi Gras a little bit better. But Carnival, it was actually happening in Venice. As we were in Venice, there were people coming in with masks, and they were all dressed up for Carnival. And Carnival is the beginning of Lent. It was the season before Lent. And what it was actually this time where you would get ready for Lent. If you know what Carnival means, Carnival or Carnival, Carnival means, it literally means carne, which is meat or beef. And so you got carne, and then the other half is vol, which means it's part of a word called leval, which means to throw away. And what it was the time before before refrigeration. And before Lent, you would throw away, you were getting ready to throw away all of your meat. So instead of throwing it away, you just ate it all. You just went for it. Right? And so what they would do is they would have this celebration of we're going to have to get rid of all of our meat because for 40 days we're not going to eat that. So they would have a celebration. And now it's the word we use for cruise lines. And it's the place you go get your elephant ears and whatever, is you go to the carnival. That's what it is now. And so as we walked through Venice and we saw people dressed up for carnival, I didn't know if you call them carnies, but that's what I call them. They probably didn't love it, but they didn't speak English. So it was like this, it's this thing where this whole idea, it started to become less about what are we going to gain from this time. It became a concern about what are we going to give up. And actually what happened in the Lent town, where Lent chocolate was started, there was another guy, by the way, who was part of this. Lent chocolate was started by a guy with the last name Lent, and his partner was named Sprungli. And Sprungli apparently got dropped from the label. He became the Roebuck of this situation, or the Abercrombie and Fitch. He became the Fitch. Nobody cares about that guy. It just became Lent chocolate. But when this was started almost 300 years after the city of Zurich, and actually Switzerland became one of the forefront places of getting rid of Lent. They chose specifically to get rid of Lent. The reason was not because it wasn't a beautiful celebration, but because people were so worried about what they were going to give up, and they were no longer worried about what they could gain. They were so concerned about this giving up of something that they had forgotten what it meant to gain something from this time. And so today, my hope and what we're going to do is this is just a very brief 101 of what fasting is, okay? This is not this is not going to be super in depth. And over this series, we're not just going to talk about food and fasting food. We're going to talk about a whole lot more than that, because I think this goes in a lot of areas of our life. And we're going to talk about everything from media to hurry to worry to the other things that we need to give up space for in our lives. But today I want to kind of talk about fasting just as a broad overview and give us a little bit of a 101 on what that looks like before we head into this season together. Again, this starts next Wednesday, and so you have time to kind of think about, what does this look like in my life? How can I do this? Is this something I want to be a part of? If it's something you don't, that's fine. But I think it's good to go back and recapture the roots of what is this thing, because I think it's an important discipline for us. If you have a Bible or a phone or whatever you use, especially if you have a Bible, this would be great for you to see it, because I think it's important. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus is in the middle of his most important teaching. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. It's his greatest sermon. This is the most important entire sermon that we have of Jesus's. We don't have many complete collections, and this is one of them. And in the middle of this, Jesus is talking in Matthew chapter 6. And if you notice what he does this really interesting thing with fasting that I think we would see differently than the way he sees it. And what it says at the very beginning of it, chapter 6, verse 2, you'll see it says, so when you give to the needy. So it just starts off with when you give to the needy. That's what he starts with. When. Not if, when. He says, when you give to the needy. If you flip over just a little bit, if you go down just a little bit, what you'll see is in verse 5. Then the next section, he starts talking about when you pray. And when you pray, when. Not if, but when. When you pray. Fully expected. When you pray. And then just a couple verses later, it says this in verse 16. It says, and when you fast. Now, I think as most of us as followers of Jesus, we would not be surprised to hear the first two. Like we would expect, even if you're not like a person who tithes or whatever, you would expect Christians to be charitable people who give to the needy. That's like a non-negotiable, right? That's something we would all expect Christians give. So when Jesus says, when you give, we're like, of course, right? The second one he says is when you pray. There is no doubt that we believe that we're supposed to pray. So when you pray, okay, we got that. These are things where it's like, yeah, absolutely, 100%. Yes, we do this. Yeah, do we give? Sure. Do we pray? Absolutely. Then he's like, when you fast, and we're like, I don't think we do that part. I don't know. Hold up. Like, let's go back a second. We're at a yes, yes, no. Like we've got yes, we do the first. Yes, we do the second. The third, not so much. We need just a second here. But notice he says it not as it's like some kind of like thing that's not negotiable, something that's going to maybe happen if it works in your schedule. He says, when you fast. We know in the Bible, this practice is one of the most important practices. And what's sad is when we lost Lent, we really lost the discipline of fasting. Fasting is a discipline throughout the Bible. Moses fasted. We see that David fasted. We see that Solomon fasted. We see that every prophet, every single prophet fasted. Nehemiah and Jeremiah, all these guys fasted. We see that even Jesus fasts. We see John the Baptist fast. We see Esther fast. Esther actually gets her entire country to fast. She, leave it to a woman, right? She got it. And so she does that. I mean, John the Baptist fast. We see every single disciple who followed Jesus would have had to fast. To this day, actually just in the 1700s, if you ever heard of John and Charles Wesley, they were founders of a church movement in England that you've probably heard of. They had a very strict discipleship process for people to come to know Jesus. It was so strict that it became called a method, and therefore they started a church called the Methodist Church. That whole thing, that whole Methodist church, they would not ordain a pastor unless he adapted his life around fasting. And every day in their calendar, every Tuesday and Thursday, they had to fast until 3 p.m., from wake up until 3 p.m. to fast. Every single pastor in the Methodist church. Like this discipline is something that's been around for a long time. I think we've forgotten about it. Really, if we're being honest, I think it's because we live in a country where we don't like that. We don't love to deprive ourselves. I don't know if you've noticed this. We don't love things that are not instant gratification. We like things to happen quickly, right? We like things that we get what we want as fast as we want it. I was reading just a couple weeks ago that Amazon, I don't know if you've heard of them, they sell books, and that's it. No, they sell everything. And in Amazon, their algorithm and their computer and like their entire system of how your computer works now, they have designed it so that it works. I know you haven't noticed this probably, but it works 1/10 of a second faster now. And what they realized was with every 1/10 of a second that they go faster in their search algorithm, every 1/10 of a second, they make 1% more in profit. So hold up one second, just real quick. Okay, so before that, they also lost money because their algorithm was slower. Last year, Amazon made $280 billion in revenue. 1% of that is still what, 2 billion, 2.8 billion? 1/10 of a second equals $2.8 billion of revenue. Do you see how fast we need things? We will spend $2.8 billion more if you can increase the speed by 1/10 of a second. We don't like to wait for things. This whole idea of fasting is it's so like counterintuitive. It feels so like against us, but it's countercultural. This is not just something that's unfathomable and unthinkable. It's something that's un-American. It's something that's just against everything that we're built to be. And Jesus doesn't say if you do it. He says when you do it. He's not just saying like it's a possibility. He's saying this is going to happen. He doesn't say it like it's going to be, when it's optimal for you. He says it like it's obvious all the time. So here's what he says. Let's read the whole thing here. He says, when you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure or distort their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they have received the reward in full. So stop right here for just a second. So Jesus says, when you fast, don't look like the hypocrites do. And what he means by hypocrites here, if that word hypocrites, we've talked about this before. The word hypocrites in Greek, it literally means he's an actor. It means you're acting. You're putting a face over your face is what the word actually means. Putting a face on your face. He's saying, don't be an actor about this. Don't put that over you. And he says, looking somber and they look disfigured because they're out here and they're fasting and they're showing you how important they are, they're fasting. Now, at this time, Pharisees especially would have fasted 2 days a week, Monday and Thursday. They would have fasted all day, Monday and Thursday. We'll get to why in just a second. But they fasted 2 days a week, and he's saying, don't be like them. They disfigure their faces. And he says, truly, I tell you, they've already got everything they want. Because what do they want? They want you to know about everything they've given up. They don't want you to know about what they've gained. They don't want you to understand a better connection with God. They don't want to have these conversations about this thing. They want you to know about how much they've given up. Now, I want to warn you real quick. I've been on this side of it, and it's not been fasting for spiritual reasons. In January, the guys I work out with, we work out at 5 o'clock in the morning for some reason, and we hate our lives. And we work out, and they were like, guys, what if we didn't eat sugar this month, like at all, in January 2020? And for some reason, I was like, okay. And I hated my life for the month of January. It was terrible. And I didn't eat any sugar at all. Like I'm talking like, I woke up the first morning that we were working out, and I went to the workout, and I said something about, so after this, I'll just have like a banana. And they were like, well, that has sugar in it. I was like, you're talking like natural sugars too? And it was like, yeah, absolutely. It's like, so what do we eat? And so I literally sent a message to all the guys. I was like, so what are we supposed to eat? And I got a message back from Raul, from one of the guys, and he just sent me a picture of his counter with all kinds of things on it. And so I went to Sprouts, and I bought the 4 things I could eat, and I paid like $300 or something. I just lived on those, just over and over again. It was terrible. And if you were near me, I complained about this. I was one of these guys. I did not hide it. I did not hold it in. Every chance I got, I was like, man, my life's terrible. How's yours going? I mean, it was just so bad. I let everybody know about it. Now, I really did. It wasn't good. Now, I will say there is a difference here. There's a difference between a diet and there's a difference between fasting. I was on a diet. I'm not saying it was right, and probably I apologize to all of you who I complained to. I really do. But it was so bad, and that was a diet. Now, what Jesus is saying here is when you're fasting, if you want your reward to be what other people see, if you want your reward to be what you've given up, then you're going to get that reward. But if you want your reward to be from your Father in heaven, and that's where he's going to go here in a second, if you want it to be what you've gained, you're going to have a whole different reward. There's a difference between being seen fasting and fasting to be seen. And so what Jesus says next is, he continues on, he says, so when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face. Like you're going to look normal. That's what he's saying here. So like put gel in your hair, look real good, and wash your face so that it will not be obvious when you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. He's going to see it, and he will reward you. This is not about what you have given up. This is about what you can gain. You can gain this intimacy with God by giving other things up. I think we have it backwards sometimes. Sometimes we think we fast and therefore we get to tell God our agenda and he has to listen because we're like depriving ourselves. We're like, see, I didn't eat anything, so therefore, God, you do what I want. What this is not about is doing this so that God listens to you. It's actually doing this so that you listen to God. So you create space in your life where you have deprived yourself of something earthly so that you can connect with something heavenly. Where you've avoided something that's of yourself so that you can get more of him. It's putting your agenda to the side so that you can hear more about his agenda for you. If you're in a spot where that's something you need right now, maybe you're in a spot where you have decisions to make, maybe you're in a spot where things are difficult, I would suggest that this is probably the thing to do. That maybe fasting, creating some margin in your life for him is more important because ultimately his agenda is going to be what happens here. We have to sometimes disconnect from the world in order to reconnect with him. We have to disconnect from the things that are physical in order to connect with him. So when we talk about fasting, let me just give you a quick definition of what I would use here. Is for me, the way I see fasting is voluntarily, that is an important part, voluntarily giving up something physical in order to gain something spiritual. It's coming to know this God, being in communion with this God, getting to have less dependency on this earth, on the physical things, so that you can gain something that's spiritual, something only God can give you. I do believe that can happen in these times. And so I want to look just real quickly in the few minutes we've got left. We're not going to go long on this. Again, this is just kind of a setup to what we're going to talk about. Next week, it's going to be a whole different section of what Lent is, and we'll go through some different things. But I do want to look at this real quickly because I think it's important. There's going to be things that are outwardly changed, but you really want this to be an inward change. And Jesus starts to talk about this in just a couple chapters. So if you're in your Bible or your phone, we're going to go to Matthew 9, just a couple pages over, and we're going to look at what Jesus does when he talks about fasting. There's a moment that he talks about here that's pretty interesting. It says in Matthew chapter 9, verse 9, Jesus is going to go call Matthew or Levi, maybe you've heard of him. It's the same guy. Both names are the same. It says, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at a tax collector's booth. Follow me, he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. So this went well. Now, Matthew is a tax collector, which means he has walked away from his faith. He does not eat anymore. Like a Jewish person would eat. So Jesus has a certain diet regimen, and this Matthew guy would have a very different diet regimen, okay? So they have kind of these alter sides of what's going on. But Jesus comes up to this tax collector, says, follow me, and he does. And it says, the next verse, while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples, which I think is fun. I just like that they call them sinners, like just flat out all the time. So sinners and tax collectors show up. That means they're going to eat something different than Jesus. That means they're eating something else that Jesus is not permitted to eat at this time. They're probably eating pork. It could be shellfish. That was something that a lot of Jews did not eat. Jesus was holding fast to his diet. Meanwhile, he was around people who were not. But it gets even more interesting here in a second because it says, then the Pharisees, when they saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? So these are the bad guys. The Pharisees come up. Why does he eat with them? Why does he sit with them? Why is Jesus in this place? And then Jesus, well, notice this. They ask the disciples. They try to like go middleman where they ask Jesus' disciples. But Jesus, I don't know if being God gives you ultrasonic hearing, but he like seems to hear what they say. And he kind of like looks over, and I love this moment where you can see that they would probably just be like very embarrassed. But it says he hears them, and he turns to them and says, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners. It's a verse out of Micah. And has anybody watched the Two Popes movie, by the way, on Netflix? It's fantastic, and they have a great argument about this verse that I just loved, and it like broke my heart, and I loved it. And he has this great line about this where he says, the bigger the sinner, the warmer the welcome. And I love it. So anyways, if you're bored, watch it. Then it says right after that, it says, then John's disciples came and asked him. This is John the Baptist. These are the good guys. John the Baptist, these are good guys. These aren't Pharisees. The good guys show up, and they ask the same question. How is it that we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? They show up the same way, and they're mad, and they ask this question, which is a great question. Here's what I believe is happening here, okay? So this idea of fasting has been going on for a long time. Actually, it goes all the way back to Leviticus 16 when God sets up a day called Yom Kippur. Have you heard of this? Yom Kippur is set up in Leviticus 16. It's a day of mourning and fasting, and it's the day to get ready for the atonement of the entire community. They're going to have the scapegoat and the other goat, and they're going to kill these goats to atone for the entire community. And on Yom Kippur, God says you're going to give up food. You're going to fast. He says it's on the 10th day of the 7th month. That's where we see it in Leviticus 16. Well, a little bit later, if you remember the kingdoms fall, there's the Jewish people, they move into a country. The country gets split. There's a northern kingdom, a southern kingdom. Northern kingdom gets taken over by the Assyrians in 722. Southern kingdom gets taken over by the Babylonians in 587. This probably doesn't matter, but what happens after that is when they get taken over in 587, they go into a captivity, and they are in this place where they run out of food as they're fighting the Babylonians. They run out of food in the 4th month. And God tells them from then on that in the 4th month they should fast because they ran out of food in their fight, and he's reminding them of what that was like. And then in the 5th month, right after that, their temple is destroyed, and God says you should fast for the temple being destroyed. And then back in the 10th month, what happens again, or in this 10th month or in the 7th month, what it says is in the 7th month that they are now going to fast one more time. They had a king. You never see him again, but his name's Gedaliah. Gedaliah is assassinated, and therefore all their hope is lost. They are now supposed to fast again. So now they're fasting about 4 times a year. There's a fast going on. But what happens is those things were to talk about what they could gain, the relationship they had with God. That's what that was for. Those moments were important to them. But by this point in Jesus, when Jesus shows up, the Pharisees have taken it, they've distorted it, they've made it only about what they've given up. They've forgotten everything they've gained from it, the introspection, the wisdom, the prayer, the supplication, the prayer for one another. They've forgotten all of that. All it's about now is showing you what they've given up. And the reason that these Pharisees are talking about this, my belief is that Jesus goes to sit down with Matthew, and it's probably on a Monday or a Thursday. Remember, these are the days that all the Pharisees and rabbis would fast. I believe they go on a Monday or a Thursday to eat this meal together. And the reason that the Pharisees chose Monday and Thursday, if you read some fascinating literature about this, there's a book called The Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster. If you read about this, the reason that they probably chose Monday and Thursday is because those were the market days in Jerusalem. And they would have the most people there to watch them fast. They'd have their biggest audience. And so Jesus is now sitting with a sinner. He's losing his biggest audience. He's not showing them what he could be as this guy who's given everything up. Instead, he's showing them what it's like to gain something. This is what gaining a relationship with God looks like. Let's not talk about what we were giving up. Let's talk about what we're gaining. And Jesus flips the script on them. And they ask this question, why don't you guys have to fast? Why do we have to fast? Now, if you remember also, just side note, Andrew was a follower of John the Baptist at this point, and soon he switches to become a follower of Jesus's. And I just wonder if it's because Jesus' disciples could eat more. I would do the same thing. You guys have sugar in there? I'm going to go with that guy. I mean, you would follow a guy who turned water into wine too. Let's be honest. So you have this moment where they ask this question, and it says right after that, okay, so it says Jesus answers, and it says, how can the guests of the bridegroom mourn? Remember that word mourn, because that's kind of an interesting word here, while he is with them. The time has come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. Then they will fast. So it says, then they will fast. They're going to fast eventually. So then they will fast. What? First of all, we have to ask this question. Is Jesus saying, there's going to be a time, I'm here on earth right now, but I'm going to go, and when I go, then they're going to fast. The question is, are we fasting? He's talking about us. He's saying, then they'll fast. Are we fasting? Are we doing this practice still? Then after that comes this important line that you've probably heard 1,000 times if you've been in church. If you've been around church, you've heard these words many, many times. But I've never understood them in the context of what Jesus is talking about. Because Jesus is talking about fasting when he uses this line, when he uses this famous verse. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record this line. And we talk about it all the time in the church, but I think we miss the context of it. And the next thing he says is, no one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch will pull away from the garment, making the tear worse. Neither do men pour new wine into old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst. The wine will run out, and wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into wineskins, and both are preserved. Anybody heard this phrase before? Jesus is talking about fasting when he's talking about this. Do you understand what he's talking about? He's talking about these wineskins where if you pour too much in them, you're going to put little patches on them and you're going to try to mend them up, but then they're going to burst because you're putting too much in them. He's saying, but what we need is just a new wineskin. We need a new understanding of what this is. We need a new understanding of what fasting is. And when we put that stuff in there, it's not going to burst. And my opinion is because we're removing things from our lives that it's not so full that it's not going to burst. See, we fill our lives so full, don't we? There's this idea that margin is like, that we have margin in our lives. Anybody think? I think it's funny. That we have margins in our lives, right? And I don't think that that's true. I don't think we're really known for margin. But there's this idea that margin is something between your load and your limit. Okay, so what is your current load that you're carrying? And then what's your limit that you cannot go beyond? That's your margin. It's between those two things. So what's the load you currently carry? What does that look like? And what's your limit that you cannot carry anymore? My guess is most of us, our load is so big that it just crosses right through that margin all the way to the limit. And Jesus is saying you have to create this margin, and here's a way you can do it. This is what fasting can look like. Fasting is something where you're giving something up that's physical in order to make room so you can gain something spiritual. And I think in our lives, we have to create that space. We're going to talk a lot more about that as we go through this. We have to be willing to do that. For me, I just want to talk for just a second about where I've been with this, because for me, fasting is something that I've done only a handful of times really well. I'm not great at it. I was in high school and was deciding what college to go to. And I couldn't really get my head around it. I really thought, I always believed if I was 6'5", I was going to play basketball at University of Kentucky. I'm 6'1", and I played guitar at Warner Southern College, and it was similar. And so I had done sports my whole life at that point. That's all I knew, and I was good at them, and I had some opportunities to play at the next level, but nothing like what I hoped for. And I remember having this like crisis of who I was and this identity of what am I supposed to do with this. And I talked to my brother about it, and he asked me, he said, Kevin, have you fasted about this? And I thought, no, because that's dumb. Like, no, nobody does that, Kyle. That's like an ancient thing that nobody does. And I'm just going to get cranky, I'm going to get hangry, and I'm not going to make good choices. And he was like, no, I think you should try that. I think you should fast. And so I did. I fasted and I prayed about it, and I ended up going the route that I went into school. And once I got to school, I was there and I was studying marketing. I had no desire to be a pastor, no desire to be a pastor, like anywhere in me. My dad's a pastor, my mom's a pastor, my brother's a pastor, and I didn't want the family business. And I was like, I'm not doing it. And so I was determined not to be a pastor, but there came a point in my life where I felt like maybe God was calling me into that. And I went to a professor of mine and said, I think I'm thinking about this. I don't know what to do. And he said, have you fasted? No, because that's dumb. And so I did, and I fasted and I prayed, and I felt that God was calling me into this ministry thing, whatever that looked like for the rest of my life. And I also believe that if you can ever see yourself doing something other than ministry, you should go do it. And I've just felt like God's called me into that thing, and I'm just stuck with it. And I felt like God called me into that. I remember when I was deciding whether to propose to Marie. I remember this decision, and it wasn't a tough decision, but at that point I had learned well enough that God had put this practice in place called fasting. And I remember actually fasting and walking this trail behind our dorms that was just, there was a Florida panther that lived back there, so you walked fast. But I walked these all the time. I would walk back behind these dorms and just fast, and I would take and it wasn't long. It was maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks for some of these different decisions. And I would fast and I would pray. And I can tell you, by making that space in my life, whether it was just the meal time that I gave up, or it was the physical like emptying of me, whatever it was, I can tell you that I felt there was a closeness between me and God. I think there's a reason this shows up so much in Scripture. Every move we've made where we've moved from one location to the other, I've fasted and prayed about that. Even starting this church, when we were in the middle of that decision, we fasted and prayed about this. I think that this discipline is something that we have to get used to. Again, it's so countercultural. It's so counterintuitive, but it's so necessary. And yes, we can sit here, and my hope is that this is what I'm afraid of, is that we hear this term, and all we think about is what we're going to give up. We see this, and we think, I have to give something up. What if we saw this and we thought, but what could I gain? What is there to gain from this time? There's really three major kinds of fasts. Let me just tell you this real quick, because I do want to be clear about this. First of all, let me tell you what a fast is not. Sometimes we use this time of Lent where we use it as like a garbage disposal of all the other things we wanted to get rid of anyways. So we just kind of throw it in there. Like, I wanted to lose weight anyways, good time for fasting. No, that's not what that's for. Maybe we use it for things that we know are sinful other times. And so we're all of a sudden like, for the next 40 days, I'm not sleeping with that person, or I'm not going to gossip, or I'm not going to, whatever it is. That's not fasting, that's just obedience. We should be doing that anyways. Fasting something on top of that. In fact, I would say fasting is giving up something good in order to get something greater. And it needs to be good from the start. Food is good. It's not a bad thing. You're going to need it at some point in your life. What God's saying is giving up something good for something greater. So first of all, let me just give that caveat. This isn't just a catch-all for the sins that we probably should have like given up another time anyways, that we just throw into this time. Those things should have been taken care of anyway. They should happen anytime because that's obedience. So there's three kinds of fast. There's the first one is just a regular fast. It's like food. It's very common. And I do think there's something to that. I think that there's a reason that through the entire Bible, there is something to that. I understand health reasons, and maybe that's not the best thing for you. I get it. But that is something that throughout the Bible is a common theme, very common, is the idea of fasting, food. And that's the first thing that you see. Jesus does it in John chapter 4. If you're bored, you can look it up sometime. But in John chapter 4, he goes and he meets with the woman at the well. They have a conversation. After the conversation is over, he hasn't eaten for a long time. And his disciples show up and they're like, hey, are you okay? And he was like, yeah. And they said, have you eaten? And he's like, no. And he says, but I have food you don't know about. And they're like, did somebody bring him a Lunchable? And then they have this conversation, and Jesus is like, no, I am filled. And what he says is, I'm filled with doing the Father's work. I don't need this physical food. I'm doing this spiritual work. So there's that. Then the other thing is a partial fast. It's giving up maybe one kind of food, one certain thing, whatever that looks like. And there is that, which is maybe it's like it is sugar, or maybe it's fried food, whatever it is. You can give up that one thing. That's a partial fast. And we see Daniel do that, right? We see Daniel in chapter 1 where he goes to the king's house and he says, I'm not going to eat what you're eating. I'll eat something else. He still eats, but it's not what they had for him to eat. And then the last one is a soul fast, which is usually some kind of creature comfort or physical pleasure. So maybe that's the thing of a Netflix or the social media or whatever. That I think is good, and we will talk about that during this series because I think that's something we all need to create space for and cut things out of in our lives. I think we could always talk about that. But that is one thing that you can also do is kind of a soul fast. And that's kind of the third way. We see that happen also in Daniel. There's a moment where Daniel says that he will no longer use his lotions, which was like a creature comfort. It was like he didn't put on deodorant. So I would prefer if you don't do the deodorant one. Like, you can do other ones, but your friends and family would prefer that. So there's different types of doing this. I mean, there's different ways of fasting. I would just encourage you to pray about that and to think about what that could look like. If we start this on Ash Wednesday, if we go 40 days to celebrate Easter, what would it be that you would give up? What would be the things that you give up? And not just to give them up for vanity, not just to give them up so you feel better about yourself, but to give them up so that you can gain something even greater. I think if we're honest with ourselves, we need this. It's a discipline that we've lost. And it is so countercultural, and I think there's a reason that we need it so badly. And so maybe if you look at this time, don't think about it as what you're going to give up. Think about it as what you could gain from being a part of Lent, being a part of this ancient tradition to prepare us for the death and the resurrection of Jesus. What could you gain in those 40 days? What kind of conversations would happen if it wasn't about, here's what I'm missing out on right now, but those conversations were turned towards, this is what I'm gaining and what I'm learning about God through this time right now? What would it look like if your thought process was different because you weren't so cluttered up with certain things and you could free up your mind so that you weren't focused on the things of earth, but you were focused on the things of heaven? So as you think about that, as you pray about that, we'll begin that in about 10 days. So I encourage you to think about that and just pray about that. Today, you don't have to worry about it because we have lunch here afterwards. And so you're welcome for that. So if you would, let's stand together and pray. And we're going to sing before we leave here to kind of ask God to be the king of our hearts, be the king of our bodies, be the kings of our minds as we leave this place. Let's pray. Jesus, I thank you for today. I thank you so much for who you are, and I thank you so much for your example to us. And Jesus, I thank you that you love us and that you set this example, that you put it before us. And there are so many things that we get so hung up on in this world, and there are so many earthly things that can drag us down. I pray that we would be willing to set aside 40 days of giving something up, not just to give it up for vanity, but to give it up so that we can gain more of you. That we would give up something voluntarily that's a physical thing so that we can gain more in our spiritual lives and know you more. And today, God, I pray that as we look at our lives, as we look at the things that are so busy and so cluttered and just so many things that are happening all the time, I pray that you would help us to make space for you in this next season. I just thank you that you made space for us. For 40 days, you fasted and prayed so that you could be here with us and that you would do your ministry here on this earth. I pray that we would give up those 40 days to be with you, to turn that around and to spend time knowing you better, to gain our spiritual lives back. Jesus, we know it's so easy, and you said it, to gain this whole world, and yet we lose the very soul within us. I pray that we wouldn't be victims of that we'd be able to live here on this earth, but not be full of this earth. We'd live here on this earth to be full of you and your kingdom and your resurrection in our lives. I thank you so much for this community. I thank you for what you're doing in and through us and just in spite of us even. I thank you for what you're going to do over the next 40 days when we begin this together, what the lives that are going to change, the revelations we're going to have, the breakthroughs that are going to come through in our life. I thank you for those things in advance. I thank you for the insights we're going to gain about who you are and how you work and what you're doing in our midst. If we just give up other things, that we would be able to focus on you. I pray for the next few weeks that we spend together in this series, that they would be meaningful and powerful, and that we would be different people by the end of this season. So thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you're doing, and I thank you for whose we are. In your name we pray. Amen.